Let me tell you a little about Lula, the case against him and the case for him. Lula is a phenomenon. He was at 8 years old selling peanuts on the streets of the slums in North Brazil to make money for his mother and his brothers and sisters. He never did an exam in his life, except at 14 he passed an exam to become a lathe operator. And that he was until he was about 30 and drawn into trade union activities. He never went to university. He never absorbed any of the isms of the 60s, Trotskyism or communism. And I think that was probably one of his strengths as a trade union leader. He wasn't doctrinaire. His only concern was to get better conditions for the workers and to increase their human rights. And that was extraordinary in a country of 200 million people where poverty was to a very large extent endemic. He first of all led the union movement against the military junta, overthrew that, and then gradually, by setting up a political party, he believed that the trade unions would not achieve their aim of improving workers' conditions unless they had a political party. So he founded the Workers' Party. And between 2003 and 2010, he was president of this enormous country. And his achievements were truly great. He lifted some 40 million people out of poverty, and that's conceded even by his enemies. He developed programs that are still recommended by the UN today, the program of giving money to the wife in the family and not the husband, and make sure she kept it so long as she inoculated her children and sent them to school. These far-sighted, important programs still work for the relief of poverty, and his crediting of keeping 40 million people, lifting them out of poverty, twice as many almost people as live in Australia today. So that was one of his many achievements on the world stage. He opposed George W. Bush over Iraq, but nonetheless retained friendly relations on the whole with America. He was a wise and astute leader. Of course, he made enemies, vicious enemies, the right-wing press in particular, whose right-wing obsessions put Rupert Murdoch in the shade. A really vicious press against him, and of course elite groups like the judges. To be a judge in Brazil, you do an exam in your 20s and then you're part of this judicial elite. So they came after him. Oh boy, did they come after him. 200 policemen and prosecutors having complete control, and one judge in particular, Judge Moro, who, and this goes back to the extraordinary nature of criminal law in Brazil. It is based on the inquisitorial system devised by the Catholic Church in the 17th century and not affected by any human rights considerations. It was inherited, of course, from Portugal in the 1820s, and of course the system in Portugal has changed dramatically, so it is nothing like the system in modern Portugal. But here is what the judge, the investigating judge who becomes the trial judge, incredibly, can do. First of all, once the judge has a case, he's entitled to keep suspects in prison for as long as he likes, until they confess. It's called pre-trial detention. It's a problem in a number of Latin American countries. Human rights bodies are condemning it all the time. But nonetheless, there is no right to bail. Suspects can be held for as long as the investigating judge likes. And of course, they confess. They're held until they confess, until they plea bargain, and their confessions are utterly unreliable because they are confessing in order to get out of prison. Now, that is one thing that this Judge Moro, has done. The other thing, many other things that would be amazing if any judge perpetrated them in Australia or any civilized country today, he can tap the telephones of suspects, and he has tapped Lula's telephone, the telephones of Lula's lawyers, their switchboard, 200 lines. He's tapped the telephones of Lula's children and their spouses. So not only does he tap their telephones, but he releases the transcripts to the press, to the media, to the violently anti-Workers' Party media. And not only does he do that, but he releases the audio tapes so they can be played for the delectation of a media that is avid for scandal. So this he's done on several occasions, notably a telephone conversation that was illegally taped between Lula and Dilma Rousseff, his protege who took over the presidency when he retired at the end of his second term. So this is outrageous by our standards. No judge would be allowed to do that in any civilized country. But he does it in order to demonize Lula. He himself believes, he's actually written about this, that judges should be attack judges. They should demonize the politicians that they wish to target. And that is what he's attempted to do with Lula. The most extraordinary events have taken place. I couldn't believe it when I came to Brazil for the first time. There were pictures in magazines devoted to this judge. He was being hailed as the hero of Brazil. He was giving press conferences condemning Lula. He even attended the book launch of a hagiography that had been written about him, and he signed copies and generally disported himself so as to demonize the target of his investigations. Now, that behavior is bad enough when it comes from a prosecutor, but when it comes from a judge who, under this primitive system, inquisitorial system, then when he arrests the suspect, he becomes the trial judge. Now, it's absolutely fundamental in any decent criminal system that you are entitled to a trial by an impartial judge. This Judge Moro is not impartial. He's devoted the last couple of years to attacking Lula, to writing judgments that his telephone can be tapped because he's a suspect and so forth. He's utterly prejudiced, and yet he is now the trial judge. Can Lula object to him? Of course, Lula has. Where does the objection go? It goes to Judge Moro himself, who's decided against all the evidence that he's not biased. Of course he is. He will give Lula an unfair trial. There is no doubt in my mind that he will convict Lula, and his conviction will come in time to stop Lula standing again as president for the Workers' Party in 2018. The last time he stood in 2006, he got 58 million votes. He was the most popular man in the world. No one in a democracy has ever got as many votes. He may well be president again in 2018 unless Moro can convict him, and thus he can't stand. And who might be elected as president? All the press say that Moro himself should stand and become president of Brazil. Moro has not denied this possibility. So we have the extraordinary situation where Lula, who has done very good things for people in Brazil and in the world, he's gone around the world explaining his policies for lifting people out of poverty, is really being persecuted, not prosecuted, persecuted by a judge taking advantage of this primitive system. And, oh boy, is he taking advantage. He gives press conferences whipping people up to demonstrate, demanding that Lula be put behind bars. He's like Donald Trump in relation to Hillary Clinton. He's encouraged demonstrations where they have Lula dolls, Lula balloons, effigies of Lula in prison clothes. And this, of course, is the result of media management by the extremely right-wing media monopoly, Globo, that exists in Brazil. So in all situations, it is a case of the most monstrous perversion of the rights of the defendant, the rights of a suspect locked up until they confess, the rights of a suspect not to have one's private conversations distributed for sensationalism in the media, and the right to be tried by an independent and impartial judge, which this particular judge is not. Of course, in order to prosecute political corruption, you have to do so both effectively, and that means you have to do it fairly. The charges against Lula, I've looked at them, there's nothing to them. There is nothing in the evidence that suggests that at any time in his presidency, Lula did a favor for anyone who subsequently paid him. There is no discovery of money stashed away in overseas bank accounts. He lives very modestly in a flat that is really a lower middle class flat in Sao Paulo. And there is no evidence yet discovered by the prosecution of any corruption as we would know it, no bribe that he's taken while he was president. Of course, he's not, despite his high position and the respect which one should have for him as a successful workers' politician, he has never pretended that he has any kind of immunity. He's always gone and answered police questions. But as I've looked at the evidence, there is really no evidence of corruption. There is evidence against others that while Lula was president, they, corrupt building cartel, did rip off the Petrobras, which was the national oil and gas company, but there is no direct connection to Lula. He was, of course, the president of a country with 200 million people. The idea that he would have known about this little stain of corruption in a national company is ridiculous, in the absence of any evidence that he did know. There is no evidence that he knew of it or approved of it. So these are just some of the reasons why the international community, those who care about human rights, no matter what side they're on, whether they're pro-trade unions or against trade unions, should be greatly concerned about the persecution of a man who has achieved in his life a great deal, and the persecution of him by a primitive legal system that denies him his basic rights. He cannot get a fair trial in front of Judge Moro. He will be convicted. No judge in Australia or anywhere else could survive behaving this way. Of course, it's fine for a judge to be a prosecutor. You can sit on ICAC and investigate politicians very closely. But the whole point is that once ICAC has the evidence, it is handed over to a prosecutor who then has to persuade a judge and jury that the suspect is guilty. There are no juries in Brazil. Moro, except in murder cases, Moro will sit without assessors entirely on his own to convict the man whose guilt he has already predetermined. This is a rotten and a wrong system, and no matter whether, as I say, you're for or against trade unions, workers' parties, or the work that Lula did, you cannot, as an honest lawyer, be happy that he has been subjected to this rotten persecutory system which gives him no chance. And for that reason, the demands of those who are concerned with human rights in Brazil are that he get a fair trial, that he will not get at the moment.